I believe the war started 9 years ago, not last year. I think it started in February 2014. It started with the violent overthrow of President Yanukovych, which I attribute to a significant extent to U.S. Participation in a regime change operation in Ukraine. And to my mind, that really was the trigger of this war, meaning that we are basically seeing a proxy war between the United States and Russia, plus both sides playing on the very aggravated ethnic divisions within Ukraine. So Ukraine is a divided country, ethnically, historically, but that meant that there was competition between the United States and Russia for control, for influence, even for putting military bases and the US NATO alliance. And I view the lack of prudence by both sides, but since I'm an American, I will focus on the lack of American prudence as being absolutely central to this. If the United States had sense, and by the United States, I don't mean the American people, they're never asked about any of these things. This has nothing to do with the American people. This is to do with a small group in Washington, in power. You could call it the military-industrial complex. It's a fair name for it. They don't have prudence, and we are at war because of that lack of prudence, in my view. I don't think anything specific about Putin's personality plays any important role in this. I don't think that this is some idea of recreating the Russian Empire. By the way, we hear lots of things in the mainstream media, which to my mind are completely unrecognizable regarding the truth. And just one more small point. I was economic advisor to President Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to President Yeltsin. And I was an economic advisor to President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine. I didn't choose sides. I liked them both. There's no reason why this war needed to happen, but I'll focus, because of being an American, on the lack of sense of the military-industrial complex in the United States. And I think that that was a major, major cause of this war.
You said personality doesn't really play that role. So you mentioned NATO and probably you said structural causes and hegemonic competition. And of course, Russia's perception is that Russia wanted to wall off NATO. So he was not really successful, because now NATO is everywhere. So NATO, Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, and NATO troops are permanently deployed in Poland and the Baltic states. Right now we have a huge NATO military maneuver in Germany, and also Putin wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, and now Ukraine is the most militarized country in Europe. Was Putin's decision a big geopolitical blunder?
Well, it's a big geopolitical tragedy. What happens from now still remains to be seen. And let me be clear about the NATO issues. It's my, it's without doubt the American plan to expand NATO to Ukraine already in the mid-1990s, well before there was Putin as president. It is my understanding from a discussion with one of our leading historians recently that the plan to expand NATO to Ukraine was made in 1992, basically within weeks or months of having promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. So this is not something new. It's not something about Putin. It's something that predates Putin. There's a fascinating article by Zbigniew Brzezinski in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is our establishment foreign policy magazine, in 1997, where he spells out the timeline to NATO enlargement to Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and Ukraine almost precisely in 1997, because this was a U.S. plan at the top levels. When an article is written like that, that's not just an opinion of an author, that's informing the elite opinion in the United States what the real plan is. So this was in the works for decades. And the specific idea about NATO, spelled out by Brzezinski both in Foreign Affairs and in a book called The Global Chessboard that he wrote in 1997, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea region. This is out of the playbook of Britain and France in 1853 to 1856. It's almost reliving the Crimean War. The idea of the Crimean War was that Palmerston wanted to kick Russia out of the Black Sea. Brzezinski had a similar idea in the mid-1990s. The US neoconservatives had a similar idea back to 1992. If Ukraine and Georgia become NATO members, then if you look at the map, you see that Russia is surrounded by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. Even the idea of expanding NATO to Georgia, to me, is the giveaway. Last time I checked, Georgia is not a North Atlantic country. It's in the Caucasus. What in heaven's name is NATO doing in Georgia? This is where things really went awry. It is official US doctrine. It's surprisingly official, by the way, because you can find it in many, many documents, that the US goal is to be the dominant power in all parts of the world. To my mind, no thanks. That doesn't make me feel any safer. It just means endless wars when 4.1% of the world population presumes that it's going to dominate the world. But this, I believe, was part of US foreign policy at the core already for decades. And NATO enlargement is part of this. There's something particular about Ukraine. It is 2,000 kilometers of border with Russia. It is, from Russia's point of view, a direct security risk to Russia. I would take the same view as a Russian, and I would take the same view as an American vis-a-vis Russia. I actually don't want Mexico to have a military alliance with China. I don't want Mexico to have a military alliance with Russia. And I don't want the United States to have a military alliance with Ukraine for the same reasons. It doesn't make the world safer.
If NATO expansion was one of the main causes for the decision by Russia to invade Ukraine, because, of course, of the fear that it might be a similar situation as we had with the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, that NATO missiles would be deployed there. However, there have been several proposals since 2008. There was the Bucharest summit when NATO promised Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members, but not later than 2014 for a neutrality of Ukraine. So neutrality defined no NATO membership, but at the same time the withdrawal of Russian-supported militias in the east. So could have a neutral Ukraine avoided the war? Why was it discarded? Of course, since 2019, we know that Ukraine has the NATO membership in its constitution. Before 2008, there was some forth and back independence, neutrality, NATO membership. But not later than 2005. NATO membership was an aspiration by Ukraine. So if Ukraine would have defended or presented a credible neutrality, could the war have been avoided?
Of course, it could have, and Austria's history is a glorious demonstration of the success of neutrality. Austria was not threatened in the years from 1955 onward by being a non-NATO neutral country. Austria regained its sovereignty and the Soviet Union went home. And incidentally, the Soviet Union went home in 1955 because not only was the state treaty signed in the Belvedere agreed and the neutrality declared by the parliament of this country, but also the Soviet Union was saying to the United States, do this for Germany and the Cold War ends. Make Germany neutral. What is this NATO business? This is a threat to us. Germany claimed 20 million lives of our citizens. Why are you rearming Germany? And our greatest statesman, practitioner of the day, one of our great historian diplomats in modern history, George Kennan, said at that moment, use the Austrian example. Have a neutral Germany and tell the Soviet Union, go home, out of Central Europe, out of Eastern Europe. Now you don't need that buffer zone because Germany is neutral. The United States would have nothing of it. The United States has never believed in it. You were lucky. They weren't paying attention. But for Germany, no way. We were going to have NATO. The end of the 1950s, Eisenhower even said, give them nuclear weapons. That's okay. And that is why in a series of horrible events, we nearly arrived at nuclear Armageddon with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States has a very hard time thinking through the eyes of anyone else. And when I say US, I'm meaning literally a small group of a few hundred people. I'm not speaking about the American people. They're not told anything about this. And just as a footnote, I've tried to explain the role of NATO in this to the New York Times, and they will not print anything on this. They've written 26 editorials since February 24th, 2022, that this is an unprovoked war. I called them, I wrote to them, I said I've advised all these leaders, these countries, I've been through this for 3 decades. Can you give me 700 words? The answer is no. There's a complete unwillingness to have any discussion about this. Because if you do, you're put on Ukraine's blacklist and you're put on America's no-show list in the mainstream media. It's really quite something. One more thing that's worth everybody understanding. This is not about Democrats and Republicans. This is not at all about partisan politics. Biden is no different from so many other presidents. It's not, this one's crazy, this one's not crazy. They're all a little bit, but this is about really state policy in the deepest structure in Washington. And it's the Armed Services Committees, it's the very $900 billion military budgets. You have to test your weapons, believe me. You need wars not so infrequently. You have to be ready. You have to teach China a lesson. In the minds of this small group, this war is as much about China as it is about anything else. Isn't that surprising? It's hard to think the way they think, but you cannot actually discuss this in the United States right now, in the mainstream. Of course, there are 1,000 outlets to discuss things, but not in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, MSNBC, CNN. Forget it.